Welcome back to Apocalypse here. Today we're going to give an apocalyptic response to the new perspective on Judaism. In particular, what do we do when Paul seems to be talking about Jews and Judaism legalistically in his texts? Given the new perspective's failures that we talked about last time at the textual and argumentative level, is there actually a way forward that doesn't commit Paul to saying really egregious things about Jews and Jewish practices? I think that there is, and I think it's actually pretty straightforward. But before I go into that, I kind of want to review briefly, and I'm going to use a teaching tool, which is really just pictures that I drew on my iPad that my one of my professors would use to kind of explain the different approaches. I mentioned the conventional reading last time. This is not a response to the new perspective on Judaism. This is part of the reason why the new perspective on Judaism is important, because it starts off, so you see I have box A and box B here. Box A is sort of defined by works of law. Now, the conventional reading construes this legalistically, which I think is the correct way to construe it. But what happens is, according to this approach, the Jews basically fail at adequately performing works of law, and God is really irritated with that and is going to kill them. This sort of opening scenario in box A basically collapses because you can't actually fulfill the works of the law. So you're sort of turned in on yourself. You feel guilty. You're afraid because God is going to punish you. And then there's kind of an easier way out of this, though. Instead of this legalistic way, you get the option to have faith and sort of escape that initial scenario. So you move from that initial phase, box A, in terms of works of law, into box B, which is defined by faith. Now, last time we talked about the new perspective, and it had kind of two different variations in terms of how it handled works of law. It redefined the phrase to mean sociological boundary markers. Now, a part of this, one angle on this would be that part of the issue is that the Jews were hoarding their practices, and that's sort of why boundary marker is kind of a inaccurate term for that. So they're hoarding their practices. That's what works of law is sort of getting at. The way out of that, the solution to that, so box B, would be something like sharing those boundary markers with other people. Not faith at all, and we talked about the problems of how this really is far away from how Paul talks about works of law in relation to something like faith and in relation to Jesus. So this didn't really work out. It has a second variation, which is that the problem really has to do with ethnicity and ethnic practices per se. So that's really what works of law is sort of pointing us toward. This is a problem. So the solution to that is a kind of universal non-ethnic church, really, characterized by faith alone. So you get out of this problem with ethnicity by having faith, sort of leaving all of that stuff behind. And as we talked about, this leads to all sorts of problems. So what we're going to need to do, like any careful reader of Paul, is we need to attend to the historical circumstances in which Paul wrote his letters. I brought up Galatians 2 last video to talk about how works of law, quote-unquote justification, something to do with faith, are all combined argumentatively by Paul in a clear way. So we're going to need to figure out how to handle that. And I think the way to do this is discerning the reasons why Paul wrote Galatians in the first place. And the clearest evidence we have is right at the beginning of the letter. Paul writes, starting in verse 6, "I'm astonished that you were so quickly deserting the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel," which is really no gospel at all. "Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion and are trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than the one that we preach to you, let them be under God's curse." There are clearly figures running around in Paul's community preaching something that's antithetical to his gospel. So we'll follow the lead of one of the most important recent interpreters of this scenario, J. Lee Martin, who called these opposing figures the teachers. What we learned from Martin is that Paul wrote Galatians to counteract the false gospel of the teachers, who had apparently shown up and started basically sheep stealing. What's interesting is that this biographical move helps us give a different account of box A. So let's go back to Galatians 2:15 to 16, where we have this binary of works of law and justification. Faith, Jesus, all floating around. So we have in view box A, characterized by works of law, again, and box B. Everyone really agrees that this binary is present, but their significance and relationship are certainly disputed. I hope it isn't too obvious to say that what is evident here is just a basic opposition between a false gospel of the teachers, box A, and the true gospel according to Paul, so box B. Okay, this binary is not denoting in any clear way a transfer from one to the other, which is what we got in all the other accounts that I mentioned at the beginning. These are just two different gospels. The first has to do with works of law in some way. This is the teachers. And the second has to do with Jesus, faith, faithfulness, something like justification. This one is Paul's, okay? And just a caveat, I think that Galatians, Philippians, and Romans were written around the same time. So the teachers or opponents in all three are the same guys, okay? So you can see Douglas Campbell's framing Paul for the reasons why that is plausibly the case. So to fill this out a bit more, the teachers seem to have been preaching a legalistic gospel surrounding works of law, a gospel that could be dubbed contractual or conditional. Okay? The way to be saved and resurrected is if you do the works of the law. So box A is another gospel. It has nothing to do with Paul's own theology, except to highlight that he's emphatically not legalistic, conditional, contractual in this way in his thinking. And he is deeply angry at those who are sort of imposing this onto his converts and scaring them. Now note what we've done. We have not modified the legalistic meaning of works of law. Once we grasp the biographical move to do with the teachers, we can see that Paul is suggesting that this particular group of what seem to be Jewish Christian teachers are preaching as legalists, emphatically not all Jews in Paul's day or all Jews across space and time were so. So we can retain the fact from the new perspective on Judaism that many Jews in Paul's day were not legalistic, but covenantal nomists. It just turns out the ones who were causing Paul and his church trouble were in fact legalistic in the way that he's describing them. And I think this solves the problem actually posed by Sanders, at least in part. Just to anticipate where I'm wanting to go in the next few videos, if box A is not Paul's gospel, but an opponent's gospel, and box B is gesturing toward what really drives Paul's thinking, we're going to need to give an account of faith in relation to Jesus that avoids the problem of conditionality or legalism evident in the false gospel that Paul's opposed to. Furthermore, if Paul's gospel is not legalistic, but utterly unconditional and loving and centered on Jesus, how do we unpack this precisely? Really what Paul's getting at in box B, in a way that avoids the nasty problems of the conventional reading, and in a way that's far more coherent than the new perspective on Paul, which shouldn't be that hard. And lastly, what about Romans 1-3, where the problem of works of law in relation to Judaism shows up with some serious teeth? So this is where we're going to be headed in the next few videos. If you have any questions about this video, please leave that down in the comment section. Like the video if you aren't subscribed to the channel. It would be great if you did. So with that, this has been Apocalypse here. Christianity you can live with.